Hello, everybody, and welcome to a Parallel Quest television series review. Today, we are talking about the brand new television series by Amazon Prime, The Wheel of Time. I'm one of your hosts, Cody Haggard, and alongside the internet from me, holding up his very own copy of Eye of the World, Zach Butler. Zach, how you doing today, man? How are you feeling about Wheel of Time coming into this?
Boy, I am feeling actually really excited for this. I just finished watching today, so we're recording this Saturday night. It dropped on Friday, so I just finished watching it a couple hours ago, so it's all still fresh in my mind, and I'm excited, man. I'm really excited to talk about this.
Yeah, I'm excited too, because I have, we kind of were talking about it before the show. I have a lot of mixed feelings about this. Mostly good, but I'm not coming into this like, man, this was the best thing I've ever seen. There's legit criticisms, but there's a lot of good here, especially like the production value of the whole entire series, how it looks, the action, all that stuff was very well done. But we will get more into that. But first, let's just set the stage here real quick before we go into our review. What are each of our backgrounds with the Wheel of Time? Because I think one of the things is, and I really want to let this show stand on its own legs and kind of talk about it from that lens, but just to give everybody background, share each of our experience with the Wheel of Time up to this point. So, Zach, what is your history with the Wheel of Time as a book series and now television series?
Yeah, my history goes back about 6 years. I was trying to think before the show, when did I pick up my copy of Eye of the World, the first book in the Wheel of Time saga? And it was at a used bookstore back home in Ohio. I had known about Wheel of Time. I knew at the time that it was the fantasy epic. Like, if you wanted to get into a high epic fantasy novel or series, Wheel of Time was the one. Like, it's the longest one, has the most characters, the most places, a really in-depth magic system. It was like, this is the next step in fantasy. This is before I knew about Brandon Sanderson. So I picked up the book and dove in, and it was probably my first exposure outside of Lord of the Rings to high fantasy. And I will say, there's Lord of the Rings, and then there's the Wheel. Like, that, it does kind of take a step in the direction of, okay, we're really going to get into this world. Because just to give a little bit of background, Robert Jordan wanted to kind of take that next evolutionary step with fantasy from Lord of the Rings. So he basically took all the great things that Lord of the Rings does and just expands it. So yeah, to me, this was like, whoa, this is a dense read, but it's very rewarding. It's very well written. But 6 years ago is probably when I dove into Eye of the World. How about you, man?
Just to kind of mention, talk about what you're saying there real quick. I think my copy of Eye of the World, I think I have the same copy as you. Like, there's a reviewer who said, and he puts it so well, because I think this is what it is. He says that Jordan seeks to put flesh on the bones of Tolkien's Middle-earth. And I'm like, that's a pretty good description, because it's very detailed. It's a lot more focused on the development of the characters and the politics of the world and the very different moving facets, whereas Tolkien's Middle-earth is wonderful. It's great. I love it. But it's very much structured more like a heroic mythology, whereas Wheel of Time is like that, but you get to see it in more of a personal lens, right? The characters are sought to be more human than, archetypical hero types, even though they're archetypes. But we'll get into that a little bit as we go through this series. But basically, my background is about the same time, probably like 5 or 6 years ago, I started really getting back into reading fantasy, and I had read the first Game of Thrones book. I was reading the Witcher books, and, obviously I had a history with Lord of the Rings. My brother actually, he knew about my love for fantasy, and he got me a copy of Eye of the World for Christmas. And I, like every year for the past 6 years, I picked up the book, started it, got through like the first 100 pages, and then life happened and I put it down. I didn't pick it back up. And then, so anyway, about 10 days ago, I was like, you know what? I'm going to finish this book. And I hammered through it, man. I was reading it, I was doing the audiobook, and I really loved it. There was so much in Eye of the World that is very much trying to pay homage to Tolkien, follows in the footsteps of Tolkien, but also clear deviations from what Middle-earth did and clear deviations of where it's going to go. It's definitely setting itself up to be like, hey, this is a long game type story. We're going to cover a lot of ground, a lot of turf. This isn't as simple as just throwing a ring in a mountain. There's a whole lot going on here. We're talking about, world-changing stakes, and the foundation of what is set in Eye of the World is truly epic, and I look forward to reading more books, but to this point, I've only read Eye of the World. Have you read any more than the first book? Did you read The Great Hunt?
Yeah, so I didn't read all of it. I had gotten about halfway through. I have a weird copy of The Great Hunt. I thought I had bought The Great Hunt when... Afterwards, I got home and realized that I bought part 1 of The Great Hunt. So I bought the copy.
Bought the two-parter.
Yeah, I bought the two. I didn't buy the second part, unfortunately. So I'm only halfway through part 1. And then later I found out, for some reason, The Great Hunt is split into 2 books. And I don't know why, honestly. Like, all the other books are, to my knowledge, 1 book. And I could be wrong on that. But it was my first experience with the fact that book number 2 in this 14-book series is split into 2 books. So I only got a little bit into The Great Hunt. And then, honestly, that kind of ruined, not the story, not the book. It just ruined my experience reading it, knowing that I had to buy the second half to the book that I wanted to read. So I stopped reading it for that reason, honestly. I was like, I'm just going to wait to buy the actual second book. And then I never got around to doing it.
All right, so that's our background with the series, and so what we're going to do here is we're just going to talk about The Wheel of Time, the first 3 episodes, giving a review. Our overview here is we're going to talk about how good is the story, the overall plot of these first 3 episodes. What do we think about the characters? Do we like them? Do we hate them? Do we love them? Do we loathe them? And what do we think about the world? How well have they built up the world? Because if a world matters in any type of series, it really matters in fantasy. And the world itself can get you excited about tuning in every week, but if you don't connect to it, it can be like, I'll forget it, and you'll move on to something else. And then we'll close up here by talking about how excited we are to keep going on in the series after these first 3 episodes. So what we'll do is because it's just easier to talk about a series, we will say that we're going to talk about the story, and we're not really going to try and avoid spoilers here. So if you're looking for spoiler-free review, you can find one of those, but come back here and hang out with us. We'll talk about spoilers, although, gotta say, not a bunch of things that are going to ruin the show for you if they're talked about here. There's the big plot twists and things like that haven't happened yet in the television series, and I'll be surprised if there's a ton of huge plot twists in the first season of the show, but we'll see where they go. And so we'll just have a discussion here. So Zach, what did you think about the overall story structure, delivery, pacing of the television show?
I really enjoyed the structure that they went with, especially as someone who finished this book a while ago. I was coming in just with pieces and parts of what the story was. There's large gaps in my memory with where it goes, but what I enjoyed is that they hit the big parts of the story so far. In the first 3 episodes, I was like, okay, I know this happens. I know that they go to the Shigar Logoth, or that city. I was like, I know that the White Cloaks get introduced, and like you learn that Moraine's being hunted, and so I remembered all that. and it was cool to see that like happen. And I actually said this to my wife at one point because she was kind of watching it with me, and I was getting really excited because I was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I pictured, this character. Or like, oh my gosh, that like the two rivers where they start the story with all the characters and they're getting ready for that festival. I was like, that's exactly how I pictured that town in my head. It was like a mixture of a little bit of a mountain town mixed with like the Shire, and it had that feeling. And I really enjoyed the feeling of a quaint, like, what's the word? Like it's a quaint town. It's innocent. That's the word. Like an innocent town. It hasn't been afflicted with, the darkness, the sin, with whatever you want to call it. And so that's where like a lot of epic fantasy stories start, is like the main character will start in a kind of a bucolic town. And it's so they nailed that. And so to me, I really enjoyed the fact that they hit the major parts, which they were going to, I feel like anyways, because that's the plot. But the major parts they nailed, in my opinion, because it brought back the memory of the book. And so I think just on the surface level, I really enjoyed it. Like I was telling you before, I enjoy the set pieces. I really thought the cinematography where they filmed was epic, which is what you're going for with a high fantasy series. I think it was very reminiscent of that Lord of the Rings look, with the mountains in the background and just this vast landscape, these panoramic shots. I can forgive the crappy CGI at times in favor of the story. So
where did you think it was bad?
I thought the Trollocs, which for those who don't know, the Trollocs are basically the orcs in this series. I thought the Trollocs were good when they did the up close shots, when you knew that they were actors with a costume and paint and everything. Those were great. But what I kind of got annoyed with, and this might just be me nitpicking, is they did a lot of those like long, quick shots, like the like long view, and then it'd just be like torches and shadows and quick shots, and you could kind of you could tell that they were trying to, insert CGI, save some money, and not have like a bunch. I mean, it's a TV show, so you don't have the massive budget to cram everything into 2 hours, so you can't use actors for every single shot. But I thought that was a little cheap at times. I thought the wolves were pretty bad CGI. I'll just be honest. I thought the wolves were pretty bad CGI.
Sure.
Because they used real wolves when they were, a kind of surrounding Perrin, but then the long shots when Perrin and Egwene were on that barren land, you could tell that they were CGI'd. And that kind of bothered me. So just here and there. It's honestly not that big of a deal. Like I said, I can forgive bad CGI for a good story. But it did kind of take me out of the world they were building at times, because I was like, ooh, I could tell it's CGI. I don't know if you noticed that.
For the most part, I thought the CGI was actually highly impressive for a television show. Obviously they were spending big bucks. The wolves thing, honestly, I didn't notice too much. But the thing that bothered me more so with the Trollocs, I actually thought for the most part they looked pretty good. I always get tripped up when they speed up the frames for movement on characters. Like, I understand you're trying to give this perception of they're these fast moving, threatening creatures, but it just makes it look fake. Like how well they detailed the models, and how they kind of went out of their way to try and have a mix of, practical makeup and CGI. All that, you kind of lose the immersion when you notice that they're speeding up the movement on these things. You're like, oh, okay, well, that was computer. And that always kind of like, I don't like that effect. I just don't. I understand you're trying to show speed, But I mean, the things are big and threatening enough. We don't have to, show the super speed.
Yeah.
But that's a nitpick. But I
Yeah.
wasn't too bothered by the CGI. I thought it was pretty good. I thought Shadar Logoth. There were times where you're like, okay, well, this was totally shot in a sound stage, because you compare it to Emmons Field, right? And you're like, well, that looked great, and then you're in a sound stage. But those are just small nitpicks. I thought for the most part the show looked really good.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm probably nitpicking a little bit. I mean, it is a TV show, and I don't know how many episodes they have planned, and they're obviously trying to get signed on for a second season, so they gotta, kind of stick to the characters, stick to the story more than the CGI. But overall, man, I got excited because I have not watched a high fantasy television series in a really long time. Like I mean, Game of Thrones, I was here and there watching it. I didn't really finish much of it. I just caught episodes here and there and watched the last episode. So since then, haven't watched, a high fantasy show. So this got me really excited, and it made me happy to see epic fantasy back on like the screen again.
Yeah.
Like actual high fantasy that takes itself seriously, that's written well, that alludes to the past, a la Lord of the Rings, but also is driving towards something new. And so for me, I would give the first 3 episodes probably a 7 or 8 out of 10 in my book. I was just so excited. Maybe the hype for me was I didn't know what to expect. I know you said that you had higher expectations, which you'll get to. But I don't think I had expectations. I just know that this is a very respected series that's beloved by the community. The fans really enjoy this series, even though it's freaking long. But I guess I just was excited to have fantasy again. So I was willing to take, whatever. And it wasn't cheesy. It wasn't bad. They handled it well. And so like there's times where series die in the first episode because you're like, they just completely ignored the source material, or they acknowledged certain things and then, disregarded what you would have expected as a fan to be very important to the story. I feel like they got the major things in the first 3 episodes here. But why don't you give me what you thought, man? Initial impressions.
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah, so my initial impression is just the overall story, the plot, the delivery is that my first impression, because I literally just finished the book on Friday and watched the show the same day. So it was all pretty fresh in my mind. And so I thought my alarm bells actually went off right away because I'm like, oh, wow, we are not starting like the books very much at all. They changed a lot of things within the first few chapters of the book, where that was one of the things where I was like, I actually thought that, one of the criticisms of Wheel of Time as a series is that it kind of has pacing issues. There's some slogs within the books, but I actually thought that the first book moves pretty good, especially for having read quite a few epic fantasy books at this point. For being an 800-page book, Eye of the World moves pretty good. Like, it is very much a place to place to place type of story. And I thought that the introduction was actually pretty strong in the books, whereas I thought on the show they kind of slowed down to try and introduce character backstories and all of that, because they're trying to bring in some elements of like, hey, these are characters coming into this life-changing journey with some stuff in their past, with like clear character development, whereas in the books, it's very much like you are introduced to these 5 main characters. They're clean slates virtually, with not much of a backstory, right? Because it's more of like that coming of age type of model. And so I felt like in the beginning, it just kind of took a little bit in that first episode to really get going. And I thought I loved how the town looked. I loved all that. I would have liked there to have, it just didn't feel like quite as big of a party and a celebration that I like imagined in my head. They kind of introduced the Beltane Festival, and then they're dancing for a little bit, and then it all comes crashing and the Trollocs come, and it's like, okay, well, that now we're moving. And I actually thought that whole scene, it was emotional. It was, you are very much introduced to like, oh, hey, stuff has to change now. And I thought that was done pretty well. I thought your introduction to the Trollocs, the enemies, that was all done in a good way. For me, I thought that I would have liked them to stick to the source material a little bit more, but it was okay. I felt like it had a strong enough ending. You're introduced to Moraine and her powers and all of that. And you go into the second episode and you get to, I thought the way in which they introduced the White Cloaks early on was actually a good way to introduce the White Cloaks, and they're threatening, right? These are people who hunt down Aes Sedai, and they kind of introduce like a very sinister type of character. So you establish at least some type of villain pretty early on, because the truth is, like, Wheel of Time as a book is tough to adapt because the threat is very distanced for a long time in the book. It's like it's the Dark One who is never really around. They're just running from the Trollocs, right? Where it very much starts off like Lord of the Rings, right? Where they're running from the Black Riders. These people are running from the Trollocs in the Myrddraal, the people with no eyes. And I loved how they handled the magic. I thought, like, for being a TV show, I was like, it looked pretty good. I knew that it was going to be a flashy series because that's one thing that's fun about Wheel of Time. It's more of a flashy magic type of story, whereas Lord of the Rings, like, magic is in the world, but it's like you hardly ever see it happen.
Yeah.
But I thought that the second episode, it got the show moving. I thought kind of running from the danger that was all done pretty well. And Shadar Logoth? Is that what it is?
Shadar Logoth, the Dead City.
That sequence was done well and exactly how I imagined it in the book. There's some changes there, obviously, but I felt like there's a lot of things that were really faithful to the source material, a lot of changes that were made to get the story moving a little bit faster. But kind of after 3 episodes, my general impression of the story was like, it was pretty good, but I think with how much money they're spending $10 million per episode, with how great this series is, man, I was just like, I just wanted a little bit better. And so that was kind of my leaving, is I don't think it was bad, but I don't think it was great. I think if you're trying to be the next Game of Thrones, and the way that I think of that is, it's not like you have to be just like Game of Thrones. You don't have to be the gritty, the shock value, the sexual, this and that, the other thing. But I do think you want to establish yourself like, hey, where Game of Thrones was successful was something special in the realm of formulaic television, right? And that's what HBO series really seek to do. They seek to make something that feels like, hey, every single week you're watching an hour-long movie. And whereas Wheel of Time feels more of like a very good television show, but it still feels like television with the way that it's kind of paced and structured, and even down to the writing and performances to some degree. And so that's kind of what my takeaway was. And I give it, so this is actually a good score for me. So I give it a 6.5 out of 10, which is above average, and 1 thumb up. That's how I rated it, instead of 2 thumbs.
1 thumb up.
2 thumbs is 8 or higher. So
okay. Oh, okay. All right. So, we're learning Cody's scale here.
Yeah, I made it up as I went.
I love it. But no, so I wanted to ask you that before we get too much further here. With how it is structured in just a television show, as a television show, coming out in 3-episode blocks, or at least we got the first 3 episodes. How do you feel about this blend of kind of binge, because you can watch 3, but we're not going to give you the whole series, so you're not going to binge all of it in one day. So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I would say it's a little bit of the binge culture that we're still very much in, but it's kind of hearkening back to a more syndicated weekly, almost weekly release that TV shows used to, come out on. So what do you think of how it's being released?
I like the weekly releases for especially a series that's only going to be 8 episodes in a season, even up to 10. I think it's great because you get to talk about each episode, and you kind of get to talk about with your coworkers and your friends, and obviously here on the podcast about what we think about what's going on, what's going to happen next, all that. And that's fun. Like that's what makes series fun, right? The ongoing conversations. Not that you can't do that when the whole series drops, but the anticipation is kind of fun. I think that the model itself, though, is actually pretty smart, because if somebody watches the first episode and they're just kind of like, I'm just not that into it, they're probably not going to be excited enough about it if that's their impression to really tune in the following week. However, when you launch 3 at once, maybe they don't love the first episode. They're like, I didn't love it, but hey, let's see if it picks up in the second. And I'm willing to say that even if people didn't love the second, they're willing to say like, let's go one more, right? Because it is just kind of like watching a Lord of the Rings film, right? 3 hours and you're through it. So I like the model personally. I like being able to get a big chunk of the story in the beginning and then the episodic releases throughout. And yeah, I like the model. I wouldn't even mind if they did 2 episodes a week going forward. That would be kind of cool, right? Because then you could have a little bit more to talk about, a little more to see, especially with the way that this show seems to be structured. It doesn't seem like it's the cliffhanger type of show. So, I feel like if they did more at a time, that would be cool and probably even better for it. But 1 episode a week after 3, I like the model. I really do.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, man. I think it's a cool way of releasing a show. I think they're going to benefit from discussion happening around it. It'll garner more attention. It'll kind of reach a new base, I think, because the fans will be talking about it. They'll be like, okay, got to catch next week episode because we haven't gotten to this part yet. I think that it's an interesting way of doing it. I think, and I hope they're rewarded for it, because I'll be honest, I am tired of the binge watching. I don't like that shows come out all at once anymore. I used to think it was a great thing. I don't know if it's because I'm getting older, but I don't have time to sit down and do that. I wish things would be released. Maybe not 1 episode a week, but like you said, 2 to 3 episodes a week, so you can talk about it, you can digest it, you can think about it, and then you can come back and you kind of have your set time to watch it. So I think Wheel of Time is going the right way. I enjoy that about it.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think what we should do, too, is because something that is important in Wheel of Time, something that's important to this whole entire world, and larger fans than us would definitely say that this is true, is the characters. Like, even if, it takes a while for the show to get going, I think what's really important is, did they nail the characters? I don't think they nailed all of them, but I think they nailed some of them. And so, Zach, what did you think about the characters in the show?
Let me actually think about this for a sec, because when I was thinking about the book, I obviously really liked Rand al'Thor. I think that the story follows him in the book. And so I always saw him as like the main character of the book. But it was interesting because when I was talking to Leah about the show, she didn't really know who the main character was, but she thought the story was going to revolve around Egwene because she was like, oh, so she's the dragon lady. She's the one that's what she called her, the dragon lady. She's the one that's going to be reborn. And so I was like, that's interesting because to me, when I read it and from my memory was that, Rand is the main character and we follow him because he's, the male character. But for Leah, it was Egwene. And so I think this is a show that will, and a series already that lends itself to in a plethora of characters. There are so many characters, so many named characters and important characters. And so I would say on a whole, they did really well with the characters. I really liked Rand. I think a lot of people's initial is going to be Matt. Matt or Perrin, I think, is going to be a lot of people's initial favorite character because I think they have the strongest backgrounds. Although I don't think Matt's background is entirely accurate to the story.
Not at all. Not at all. Not even really close.
Yeah, he's got 2 sisters. I remember that, but his whole abusive parent relationship is definitely added. That is not how it is in the book. And actually, the funny thing is, I think in the first book he says he has 4 siblings, and then that just kind of gets retroed. On book 2, they say he has 2, and then from that point on, he has 2. So you could actually go back and read kind of like a quote unquote error in the book. But yeah, I think that. But they had to give these characters distinct backgrounds, and so Perrin, I can't even remember Perrin's background. I think he's just like Rand's best friend, honestly.
Blacksmith's apprentice.
Yeah,
quiet worker. That's it.
Yeah, so his whole backstory with his wife and all that, I don't think that was all added. But I think because they have tragic backstories, people are going to latch onto them first. And I would say Matt at the moment is my favorite character. I always enjoy the snarky, humor, quick talking character. I would like to see more of that.
He was the best. He was the best actor on the show.
Oh, by far, yeah,
for sure.
These are a bunch of unnamed people. I didn't know anybody other than Rand's father, who was Roose Bolton from.
Right.
He was the
when
only
I
guy.
saw him, I'm like, oh man, that dirty man. I can't stand that guy.
Yeah, I was like, oh wow, they're kind of nodding to Game of Thrones there, but Roose Bolton's
totally different type of character too.
Yeah, like a father, a good father.
Right, right.
Just the complete. He's trying to
complete
redo
opposite.
his image. Yeah, he's trying to salvage his image after Game of Thrones. But yeah, I would say Matt's my favorite because he's certainly the best actor. I think he's the most developed character, which is interesting because once again I keep coming back to Rand. Rand is kind of the main character, but I mean immediately we've broken off into 3 or 4 different storylines that we can kind of see. Okay, it's going to kind of go between these 3 parties. Eventually, hopefully meeting up. We don't know yet. So I think after episode 3, we're going to get to know the characters more. But initially, I think that the two characters that stand out, Perrin and Matt, I think Rand and Egwene have some development to go. I think there's still a lot to do with some of the other characters, Moiraine being one of them. Like I said, she's a wizard lady. But to be honest, she's been knocked out cold for 2 episodes, so you don't really know much about her. I think Lan has been developed well. He was one of my favorite characters in the book. I think he's going to be a crowd favorite.
Lan is just incredible.
Yeah,
tough character to adapt for TV, though, man.
Yeah, he really is. Really tough. I mean, how are you going to explain and do a warder and his relationship with Moiraine? It was kind of weird that they got in the tub together. I'll just be honest. That was a strange moment to me. I was like, listen, I get that there's an intimate connection, but it's more of protector and a wizard lady. It's just he's more of her guardian, not this totally cool with getting in a tub naked with
if
her kind of
anything, you
guy. I
kind
was
of
like,
imagine him as like the type of guy who's respects her so much, like, hey, I'm not going to invade your privacy by getting in the tub with you, but
yeah,
I
like
mean,
I'm gonna stand outside the
you know?
door looking the other way and talk to you kind of guy.
Yeah,
Not yeah,
yeah.
hey, can you turn the temperature up a little bit kind of guy.
Right,
So
right. He jumps in, then he's giving orders. Hey,
yeah, so it was yeah, so I enjoyed him in the novel because he was that reserved, hard, barely talking character that was just a total like BA when it came to fighting, and so you just I really liked him. But yeah, I think the characters we got right now are they still have development, man. They're still there's and like if you're doing all of the wheel of time or doing the wheel of time to a certain point,
yeah,
you got a lot of development to go. But I think in the first 3 episodes, they gave you enough to care, which is I think their point. The problem is there's a lot of characters to come.
yeah.
And so to develop on-screen personalities in, 45, 49-minute episodes, it's going to be a challenge. It's really going to be an uphill battle, I think, for Amazon with just the amount of characters they have to get through.
Yeah, and honestly, there's even more characters that were cut from the story or introduced later, and those are tough decisions to make because there's a lot of important characters who play minor roles, and you're gonna have to decide to cut some of those. But for me, I thought that the characters were a mixed bag. I thought that Rand felt more like a secondary character than a primary character in the show, which is fine. But he's very much like a primary character in the book. Like he's a big deal, and felt like, I felt like they kind of took him in a direction where they kind of introduce elements that kind of come into his personality and characteristics, like in The Great Hunt, because I read like 100 pages into that too. And so they kind of brought that into how his character is early on. Whereas, Rand was kind of the character in the story he's like super innocent, and he's very much in Eye of the World. He's just trying to find his way. He's in a tough position. The only character with like a bunch of personality in the beginning is Matt, and which comes through in the show as well. I think that the adaptation of Matt, even though the backstory is different, I feel like it feels like how I would have imagined the character. Is a pretty strong adaptation, quick talking, the kind of guy who you like him as a friend, but he's also the guy who's like, oh man, this guy's gonna get me in trouble every time I'm with him. Like definitely strong there. Perrin is a tough character to adapt. He's a quiet and introspective type. Those are tough characters to do on television, and I thought they did a decent job giving him a wife who they end up killing in the first episode. Still questioning why. I mean, I'm sure it's going to happen, going on in the show. It's going to be like his brokenness that he has to deal with or whatever, but it felt like okay, so we're back talking about Game of Thrones. It felt like the show was trying to chase like some aspect of shock value, and so they just did that. They're like, well, let's marry one of them and have them kill their spouse. How about Matt? Right?
It got me, man. I was like,
I mean, not Matt, Perrin. Yeah, it was a shock value moment, but at the same time, it was also kind of like an eye roll moment. My wife, she was watching it with me. She was like, oh, and I was just kind of like, oh, well, that was a waste of a character. so anyway,
like Game of Thrones has just dulled you, man. Like you're just like, shock value. I got it. All right,
Nynaeve,
moving on.
I thought Nynaeve was very well performed. Thought she did a good job with the performance. Very much how I imagined.
Completely forgot about her.
Imagined her to be Egwene. I can't really tell you how I feel about Egwene. I feel like she's a very central character, in the show. But I also felt like she didn't really say much. Like she was in a lot of scenes, but kind of didn't get a ton of dialogue. And Moiraine, on the other end, I feel like almost one of the things I liked about Moiraine in the book was she's very mysterious, just like Gandalf, right? You kind of don't know what to feel about her, whereas the show is very much kind of putting her front and center, like, hey, she's the hero, she's got it all under control, whereas in the book, she kind of works her way to gaining the trust of the 5 younger folks, you know? And because really it's almost like the whole entire book, they're like, I don't know what to feel about this lady. Like, I feel better when she's around, but at the same time, I don't know. And they add that element is definitely there within the writing. But as a viewer, you never feel that. You don't feel like, can I trust her or not? You know, the characters obviously have their tensions, but the show very much portrays her as like, hey, like she's a hero. She's the star of the show, right? She's on all the promotional material, which
she is, yeah.
She's the headlining actress, right? I mean, this is kind of a big name to have in a television series, you know? Rosamund Pike is like Oscar nominated and all that. So that's a big deal. And then Lan, who is one of my favorite characters in the book, in the show, kind of feels like Lan. It's hard to do in a show, right? You know, he's silent. He's a doer. He's not a talker. Yeah. And I feel like at this point in the show, he's actually probably had more dialogue in the show than he had in the book up to that point.
The entire,
So they obviously realized, like, hey, there's some issues with a guy who doesn't really talk much. But that's a character who I think is kind of like Moraine in the way there's always kind of mystery around Lan. And you just kind of get, you know, little snippets about him as the story goes on. And those are the types of characters I like. I like mysterious types of characters who you kind of find out more about as the story goes on. But overall, you know, the characters I thought were a little bit of a mixed bag. I think good enough to want to get invested in the show, right? I don't think any of them were, you know, atrocious to the point of where it's like, oh, what are they doing here? But I thought that Matt was probably the best executed character because he definitely was one of the better performances in the show. I thought he was pretty well written. And I think his added backstory of kind of being that protector for his sisters gives you as an audience member the best connecting point for like how hard this journey probably is for him, especially. Whereas, you know, the other ones, not as much. But anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on the characters. And then let's just go ahead and wrap it up here. We kind of talked about the world and the visuals, and I feel like people kind of got our general thoughts, but I'll just quickly say I thought the world was done well. Thought it looked great. Costume design was pretty good, and I liked it. There's not much more I'm going to say because I feel like we kind of talked about a lot of things, but that's kind of my
There's one question I want to ask you because there's a scene in the second episode that is a very iconic scene in another series, Lord of the Rings. What did you think of the fairy scene, which was filmed and shot, and it was very much a nod to
that fairy
different
scene,
source material? But what did you think?
It's in Eye of the World. It's also in Fellowship of the Ring. I like the scene, but I mean, you're not going to match the tension that Peter Jackson had with the hobbits getting on that ferry. Like, as much of a great nod as it was more of just like hey, like, this is a practical thing. We're doing this. Whereas Peter Jackson, he nailed the Buckleberry Ferry scene, man. Like, that is... that's one of the better moments.
You were on the edge of your seats, for that one. But it was funny because I was watching it and I was like, oh, I've seen this before. But then it does take a little bit of a turn. It does take a little bit of a darker turn.
Turn, yeah.
If you want to, I mean, it is a show that I will say probably paints more in gray than black and white, like Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So, Moraine is the hero. Yeah, Moraine is on all the posters and everything. But she is kind of this gray character. She talks about truth. She talks about wanting to like help people. I mean, I think Aes Sedai is like servant of all in like the actual language, but you did just kill the fairy guy that got you across for,
Yeah.
the greater good. And so we're going to be talking, I'm sure that's going to be a big theme. Like, what is the greater good? Is it right to, kill the fairy guy? Is it, you know, is it right to steal from the dead like Matt did? Like to,
Yeah.
whatever his means is going to be. I think we're about to get into a little more gray area. And I remember, Eye of the World being painted in grays more than black and white. So it's going to be a good series. I'm excited. I haven't been this excited for a television show in a while, and it's not all thrown at me at once with 10 episodes. I get to digest it over weeks. So for me, it's the bonus.
Yeah. Last thing I'll add, as far as characters go, third episode of the series got me really excited because I was a little sad when Tom Maryland wasn't with the group leaving from Emmons Field. I was like, oh man, I kind of like Tom. Like everybody's got to love the Bard, right? The Glee man. And then Glee man. I actually thought the way they introduced him in the show, it's not how it is in the book, but I'm like, okay, these are the types of changes I think are pretty strong. I thought that was a strong introduction. Liked that whole moment, that whole scene, and looking forward to seeing more of him in the show.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So that is our review.
I
almost said Eye of the World, Wheel of Time.
But that's it, everybody. And then I just wanted to answer here real quick. You said you're very excited about the show. I'm excited about the show. I think it stumbled a little bit out of the gate. The 3 episodes released, they were up and down, but I am more hopeful than I am pessimistic because I know that the story to this point, it's going to get more exciting because more exciting things are going to happen based on the source material. And I think that they're going to execute it pretty well. So that's my general thoughts. I'm looking forward to it. We will be here next week talking about episode 4 of Wheel of Time. We're going to try and talk about every one of them. Since we talked about 3 episodes this time, it's probably a little bit longer than they'll be most of the time, but I enjoyed this, Zach, and we're going to sign off here, and we will talk to you all next week. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye.